Hey, so thank you for joining us for our podcast today. We're going to be looking at immigration through the lens of the Gilded Age and then shortly after that until 2020. So, everything has a history. The start of immigration obviously started way before the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, but for this specific lesson, all we're going to be looking at as the time period between shortly before the turn of the 20th century into the 21st century. So, first off, what is the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era? So, we're going to be mainly talking about, specifically for this period, we're only going to be talking about after 1900, but overall it would be 1860s, 1870 until about 1920. So, obviously, this period covers a lot of different changes. It covers a lot of industrialization, that sort of thing. So that's kind of what we're going to be diving into. Then we're going to move into how it evolved, how immigration evolved legislatively from 1875 all the way until 2000. And then finally, we're going to be looking at what does immigration look like today and what does it look like today, because it is very important to know how we got there. So, let's start off. Roots in Gilded Age and Progressive Era. So, according to a lot of research, specifically looking at Herbert Spencer, The Coming Slavery in 1884, Herbert Spencer wrote an expose basically saying that he felt like anyone that did not work was a bum or just didn't care to work. Well, he also felt that anyone that got hurt, well, that was on you. You should figure out a way around that. But the issue is, most of the people that were working in these factories that were having such a hard time were American immigrants in the early 1900s. And so you have this issue where it's either really, really poor people or American immigrants or European immigrants coming to America. And so you get this cycle of, well, I couldn't go to work because I got hurt, or I couldn't move with the letter because I'm an immigrant. So you continue staying in this cycle of poverty. And that's something that is definitely held up over time, is this cycle of poverty and also this cycle of discrimination, because as is seen with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, the owners of the Triangle factory were immigrants, but yet they still treated their subordinates as less than they were. And so it's this continued cycle of discrimination. So with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, we see that the working conditions in the factory are not great. The entire Triangle factory was built around mass production. And they didn't really care about safety regulations. They didn't care about those things because that's not what made them money. And it ended up losing 146 people's lives for it. And a lot of those, most of those, being immigrant lives. So we get that issue. We get this issue of industrialization. What does that mean for immigrant communities? What does that mean for poor families? And it's basically saying these are the only jobs you can get, but this is how you get treated in those jobs. And immigrants weren't treated fairly. As seen with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, all these different people were basically treated as though they were going to steal things. So the only exit to the Triangle Factory was through one enter and one exit way, where guards were able to basically check everyone's bags to make sure they weren't stealing any fabric or anything that was being created. And a lot of that comes from fear. So that's what we're going to talk about next. As seen in Dr. Bush's lecture notes from the University of North Georgia, Dahlonega, Georgia, we can see that there was a fear of new ideas, a fear of communism, a fear of socialism, a fear of anarchy, and even a fear of medicine, like a medical fear. There were many medical issues such as typhoid fever and things like that that ran rapid, quote unquote, in the immigrant community. So you had those issues as well, and the immigrants were dirty and that they brought all these bad things with them. And so not only was this an industry issue and this was a political issue, but it was also a on the ground societal issue that people saw immigrants as less than them because they weren't born there. It's the same argument that people have about old and new money. New money thinks that they are able to come into society to be on the same level, but old money sees them as less than them because they didn't get it the way old money got it. And so it's this issue of you are not like me, therefore you are less than me. And this was really rooted in the Gilded Age and this idea of poor working conditions, this idea of dirtiness, and this idea of bringing political corruptness to what everyone that was higher up thought was a perfect America. So all of these different cycles, all of these different issues created immigrant discrimination in the Gilded Age. So now let's move forward a little bit. According to a Pew Research Center article done in 2015 and Erica Lee's article from Gilded Age and Progressive Era Journal entitled American First, Immigrant Last, we see this idea that there were a lot of changes between 1875 and the early 2000s. In 1875, we see this addition of a lot of restrictions and this addition of, well, what do immigrants mean? But there weren't that many restrictions because between 1870 and 1930, we see a 30 million people that were coming over to America from Europe and other places overseas. So we also, not only do we see this surge of immigration, but towards the early 1900s, it starts being based off percentages and based off specific countries. So each specific country in Europe would get a certain percentage that they were able to ship to America, basically. And once they reached that percentage, then those immigrants were no longer able to come into America. In 1950, we see the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1965, we see the Immigrant and Nationality Act, which meant only specialized skills were able to be brought into America. So basically, something happened between 1950 and 1965. Europe was no longer the forefront of immigration. Now, it had been a long enough time where a lot of Europeans had basically settled in America and had found their homes and they were widespread. They had where they were supposed to be. But in 1950 to 1960, there's this surge of Asian immigrants coming over to America, as well as Mexican immigrants and Latino immigrants coming in from Latin America. And so you see this shift of immigration laws. Then we move to 1986, which is the Immigrant Reform and Control Act, and then 1990, which is temporary protection. So temporary protection basically says that immigrants cannot be deported if there's a natural disaster going on in their country. This just helps protect certain immigrants. Basically, the argument is that, well, we can't really send them somewhere that is going through what they're going through because that country needs help before these immigrants can be sent back. And so it's just a slight protection for immigrants. Now, the biggest turning point, as far as laws go, is the late 1900s, specifically 1996 to early 2000s. So, the early 2000s saw a response to terrorism and increased border security and tight administration requirements. So, what this did was this meant that it was a lot harder for immigrants to basically get anywhere. They were no longer able to come into America like they had been previously, and this was mainly due to, or a lot of it was due to the September 11th terrorist attacks. So that's going to be where we shift now. What does immigrant issues and discrimination look like in America today? Well, you're probably thinking, well, everything's great. It's America. We're doing everything right. Well, the issue with that mindset is it's the same thing many people in the Gilded Age argued. A lot of historians that study the Gilded Age argue that we are in another Gilded Age. And at least with immigrants and immigrant discrimination, we see that this isn't 100% inaccurate. So, the issues that we deal with today for immigrants are mainly Islamophobia, a lot of it coming from the 9/11 attacks, as well as Mexican or Latino discrimination. So, in the New Gilded Age, from Grusky and Crichelli Katz, we see this idea that because of the 9/11 attacks, we're going back to this idea of Orientalism. Orientalism is the idea that Middle Easterners are dirty, they're less than everyone else, and they're backwards. And this idea, because of the 9/11 attacks, has seeped into a lot of Americans' brains. And it's changed how people view Islam and how people view Middle Eastern people as a whole. According to The Last Minstrel Show, Racial Profiling, the War on Terrorism, and the Mass Media, by Azil, we see this idea that, and this is a direct quote from this book, when virtually every single piece of mainstream media that features Middle Easterners inextricably involves themes of terrorism, violence, misogyny, and or religious extremism, one must conclude the presence of a systematic failure to portray Middle Eastern peoples with accuracy. Because of these attacks, while many Americans grew love for each other shortly after 9/11, they also grew a lot of hatred towards one group. Not everyone that is Middle Eastern, or not everyone that believes in Islam, is a terrorist. But we have had this viewpoint that all of them are somewhat bad because we connect them with what happened at 9/11, or what happened on 9/11. And those emotional connections, that blame, is rooted very deep in our history of xenophobia. Xenophobia is the idea that we are discriminative against foreigners. Even though those Middle Eastern people have been here for generations, we still have these ideas that, oh, you're a part of them versus us. And so a lot of this Orientalism and a lot of this Islamophobia is rooted in that emotional connection to what happened on 9/11. So, moving from Islamophobia and how many of Middle Eastern people are basically blamed for a lot of terrorist attacks before the media has a chance to actually tell you who committed that atrocity. Let's move to Latino and Mexican communities. A lot of people view Mexicans in a negative light. According to Erica Lee's American First, Immigrants Last, she talks a little bit about Donald Trump. Now, President Donald J. Trump has said a lot of things that many people determine as negative or hatred towards the Latino community, towards the Mexican community. And what Erica Lee argues is whether you agree or disagree with what Trump is saying, he's not an exception. His way of thinking is not new age. His way of thinking is not different. The only difference is he's saying it out loud as the president on CNN and Fox and all these other news channels that everyone watches. Other than that, he's just saying what is already rooted in American history. From the Gilded Age and before that, we see this same idea of hatred towards a different community that we might not necessarily understand. This idea of xenophobia. And that is the not an exception to how we view it today. So let's look at Latino voting. Now, according to the New Gilded Age, we see this idea that in 2016 and the 2020 elections, there is a lot of hatred and issues towards the immigrant communities, whether they be through Islamophobia or they be through Latinos. There's a big issue on who is allowed to vote versus who isn't. Social Security theft and all these different things tie into, oh, well, you're an illegal, even though you might not be, just because of the color of your skin. And all of these different ideas have given us this huge debate over what to do about politics and what to do about voting, because people don't feel like their vote's actually getting heard, because in a lot of people's minds it's getting drowned out by quote unquote aliens. And this is a real issue that Americans are facing today, just like that they were facing during the Gilded Age. So, in conclusion, I would like to be able to sit here and say that we're not living in a new Gilded Age. We've changed how we view immigrants. But the truth is we haven't. American safety and fear is still what is holding the treatment of immigrants together from the beginning of the 20th century till into the 21st century. The fear has just shifted. Before, it was communism, anarchy, socialism, and now the fear is our politics, our ability to vote, and our physical safety. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to leave you with this final question. Do you feel like we are still in the Gilded Age, or that we've transpired to something different?